Love seeing that. That's people. Anyone want to throw in the chat where you're coming from? A little bit of New York, California. We're on the coasts. Anyone else in the Midwest? No coast, best coast? Yeah, I see you, Scout. I really like DC. I'm in St. Louis right now. It reminds me a lot of it. Ooh, Western North Carolina. North Carolina does have a little bit of a coast, but you know, we'll let you count it too. Obviously, love Chicago. It's like my favorite place. Have to get back this next summer. Very excited about that. Visit the cousins. My dad did the Chicago Triathlon a couple times. Very exciting. So yeah, hope we'll get up for that. Oakland. I got some friends, a little Berkeley and Oakland West traveling. Me too, actually. And I'm at work. Wow, we still have people coming in. Love to see that. Josh, good to see you. What's up, Sarah? Another Jay Fredger out here. Got a lot of Jay Fredge action on the call. Oh, more Chicago. That's the best. We love that. We love that. I grew up in Springfield, so all you Chicagoers might have gone there for like an 8th grade field trip at some point. Go to the Abraham Lincoln, museum if you're like under 30, and like tomb and house if you're like over 30. Give it another minute or two. Still seems like we still have more and more people flying in, entering the call. Keep seeing a lot of new people showing up there. Anybody like wild places, like I don't know, New Mexico or something. Got a lot of California, got a lot of New York, a lot of DC. We love Philly too. All right, that's 12:05. I think that's about time. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming. We're all really excited to have you here. Am I spotlighted, Zach? There we go. Thank you. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. We're excited to have you here. My name is Jordan. I'm the Community Fundraising and Program Officer for the Jewish Liberation Fund. One of the reasons we're having this series, I'm incredibly excited to have everyone here. As a few of us at JLF, Rise Up, and NIF, we're talking together. One of the things that really animates a lot of us is that progressive movements are really good at organizing people. Like, as I'm sure everyone here knows, there are all kinds of different organizations, some of which we're going to hear from today, who are running powerful campaigns all over the world in the fight for justice. But we often aren't so good at organizing the money behind the organizations trying to make that lasting change. which is why, I'm sure a lot of us know stories of people who have been in the movement and been burnt out and just gotten tired and just had trouble making their lives work, in addition to actually being able to continue in this fight. So part of that is kind of understandable because people in our movements, as we often say, care about people over profits and don't necessarily think about funding as a part of organizing. But another part of that too is because funders, the people who are holding the strings, the pocket strings of the money, and giving money to these organizations, are often a little bit disconnected from the movement leaders, either in their politics or in the ways they practice philanthropy. So we at JLF, New Israel Fund, and Rise Up are three organizations who are trying to do progressive Jewish philanthropy better, in a way that empowers movement leaders to win the lasting social change that will hopefully bring on a world in which philanthropy may not even be necessary. I'm really excited for this first session, which is going to feature leaders at intercommunal movements in the US and in Israel-Palestine, which will lay out the landscape of what funding for progressive movements looks like. And we're going to talk about what gaps in that funding look like and what our movements eventually need to win, how we can do better. So to give you a little bit about, really quickly, JLF, Rise Up, and NIF. NIF New Gen, their young pulse group, is an open and vibrant community of young professionals, social activists, community leaders, and students in their 20s and 30s who are committed to the work of the New Israel Fund. New Gen provides an opportunity to learn about and engage with the most important issues facing Israelis and Palestinians today. JLF, Jewish Liberation Fund, mobilizes resources to sustain and grow a progressive Jewish movement and fund a Jewish future that we can believe in. We pursue this mission by cultivating the seeds of the Jewish progressive movement as a grant maker whose decisions are made by Black and Indigenous Jews, Jews of color, Sephardim, and Mizrahim, designing resources and courses for large funders to critically consider the role of philanthropy in dismantling unjust social systems, and organizing Jewish funders to take collective action to usher in new practices in the Jewish philanthropic space. And Rise Up initiative provides grants and capacity building support to strengthen movements for multiracial, inclusive democracy by investing in the spiritual resources of Jewish social justice leadership in the communities they lead. In just 3 years, Rise Up has distributed over $1.7 million to 50 projects across the country, working to integrate deep Jewish wisdom and practice, center the margins of our community, and drive progressive action for social change. So you'll all be getting some emails from us going forward. We would absolutely, wow, Elisheva Goldberg, good to see you here, Elisheva. You were a student when I was working at Hillel. Gotta shout you out real quick. Besides you here, like a lot of our organizations have slightly different approaches to this, but we're all working to do philanthropy better in a way that successfully empowers progressive movements and movement leaders to win the lasting change that those of us in the Jewish social justice world want to see, and maybe even a world in which philanthropy might not be necessary. So without further ado, I'm gonna turn it over to, introduce and then turn it over to the moderator of this session, the one and only Scout Bratt of the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, No Coast, Best Coast, based in Chicago. Scout has led delegations with CJNV as a part of on-the-ground solidarity efforts, in addition to having been board president for SEDEC Chicago, also a JLF grantee, an anti-Zionist congregation in Chicago, and a national board member for Jewish Voice for Peace. Scout believes organizing to end the Israeli occupation is a core part of their Jewish praxis. When not engaging in Palestinian solidarity organizing, Scout teaches comprehensive, queer-inclusive, gender-expansive sexuality education in Chicago public schools. So thank you so much, and without further ado, Scout.
Hi all, thank you so much. Wow, what an honor to be here with so many people whose names I recognize or from whom I've received very important emails and updates. It's an honor to be here and to be working with great organizations like JLF and Rise Up, as well as New Israel Fund. I want to introduce you to our panelists for today. So without further ado, I'd love to ask both Shifra and Sally to introduce themselves. Maybe we can hear from Sally first. Yeah, Sally, it'd be great to hear from you, name, pronouns, the organization you work with, your role in the organization. And it would also be lovely to hear a little bit about why you said yes to being on this panel.
All right.
And then
Hi.
Shifra will turn it to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scout. I'm Sally Abed, she, her. I am the resource development coordinator and relations coordinator for Standing Together. Omdim Biyachad, Naqif Ma'an. We are the largest Jewish Arab grassroots movement in Israel. We organize and mobilize people nationally and locally around issues of peace, equality, social and climate justice. The reason why I think, I was actually very excited about this panel. It was very refreshing for me because I really think we seldom get to talk about funding. I think it's something that we feel is usually icky. No one wants to talk about money. No one wants to talk about that they need money. No one wants to talk about the conflict or the sensitivities or, the complex relationship that organizations and movements have with their funders and donors. So this was really, I think, a very, very exciting opportunity for me to also listen from, another person, from Shifra and from all of you about what your issues are, and to get to express ours, especially, in Israel, Palestine, and our kind of story, which is kind of new, and people don't often get what we're trying to do. So thank you for the opportunity. Really, really excited.
Thank you, Sally. Yeah, this notion of this is an opportunity to actually speak truth to power in many ways, and to say what has often been left unsaid or discouraged. And I like that it's both, as your work involves, like personal and political, right? That it's important for us to do this work individually, reflecting on our role, both as you two who are deeply involved in fundraising and development work, and also think about how important it is for this to be a panel with, over 100 registrants. So Shifra, can we hear from you?
Hi, sure. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Huge thank you to NIF New Gen, to Jewish Liberation Fund, and to Rise Up. Really an honor to be on this panel. I am Shifra Sered, I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Deputy Director of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, affectionately known as JFREJ. And in my role, I help lead our development team and also do some other organizational development, organizational management things within JFREJ. I was so excited when Jordan reached out to JFREJ about being on this panel. And I was joking in some of the prep that we did. I was like, who's going to sign up? And it's like really exciting to see how many people showed up for this conversation. I echo everything Sally said about why it's important. I would also add that we know what we're up against. The right in the context of Israel-Palestine and in the US is effective, it's big, and it's well-funded. And on the left, we need to be having honest conversations about what building power looks like and how funding is required for that. I also think in this landscape, which we'll talk more about, where scarcity is both perceived and it's real, where we're all, trying to get funding to do really, really important work. I love the idea of organizations having more honest conversations, doing more collaboration, because I really think that is the antidote to this sort of scarcity mindset about money, is to talk more honestly. It's about sharing resources.
Wow. Right on. Thank you, Shifra. And I know for me, a ton of questions are coming up. I have a ton of questions. And for those of you who are listening in, I encourage you to keep your questions until a little bit later. We'll have about a half an hour of a panel, and then we'll ask for Q&A questions. You can put them in the chat. And we will gather them at that to talk through at the end. All that being said, I do want to put them in the Q&A. Sorry, Zach says put them in the Q&A. My apologies. And Zach, I'm not sure if folks should have access to that, right? I don't know where the Q&A is, but you got it. All that being said, you both spoke a little bit about being icky, or there being a component of this being tricky, and it's important for us to be having these conversations considering the landscape. I'd really love to talk a little bit about how you're seeing the landscape. And I'm specifically thinking about fundraising landscape, resource development landscape, for both your organizations, but also in general, progressive movement works at this moment. And I want us to like set the landscape, so then we can talk a little bit about like what are the things we're not talking about, whether we're not saying either aloud to one another or to funders. Either one of you can start.
Okay. I think when it comes to our work here in Israel-Palestine, wow, I have so much to say about the landscape, but I will start by saying that I do think, unfortunately, we know that the philanthropy pool for progressive causes are actually much more limited than the more traditional, longer existing, older pool of, let's say, liberal ideas of human rights and of philanthropy and democracy and things that are extremely important. But I think that, with the time, our ecosystems and our civil societies have really are evolving still and developing in ways that are, trying to tackle and to adapt to the new, almost impossible, realities that we're facing and the new political realities that we're facing and crises. And I don't think that a philanthropy landscape has caught up as much. So in many ways, we find ourselves trying to adapt instead of continuing to adapt to our reality and to our new task and to our, increasingly, more complicated task. We're actually finding ourselves doing that next to also adapting our messaging and our conversations, and that impacts also our action plan to the people with the money. So in many ways, we find ourselves really, putting so much efforts that could have been actually put in collaboration and syncing and, actually shared strategizing with an aligned supporter instead of, just thinking about the outputs. I always think about that, an aligned donor. You think about outcomes and long-term, and with an unaligned donor, you always think about outcomes, numbers, and justifying, the spendings instead of actually thinking strategy long-term. And I think that really has to do with the fact that many philanthropies just haven't caught up with civil society. Especially here in Israel, Palestine, I always call it, and I'm not trying to undermine, the work that has been done for decades here, but it has almost become like a peace industry, right? And it's still like very stuck in this dichotomy and binary and, narrative bridging and all these different, things that are unfortunately proven not very effective, especially with a very increasingly complex and complicated reality. And we find ourselves, providing in my opinion, revolutionary, methods and ideas that are just very few philanthropies can actually fathom. But we're getting there. I do think that it's possible to actually impact that too. There's an organizing to do there. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Sally, I'm hearing you talk about you are having sort of different types of conversations with different funders depending upon their alignment that ultimately may not serve the larger project in the way that you maybe want to be focusing your time. And so there's a bit of a disjointed, disconnected process you have to endure or move through in order to actually do some of the work, because maybe we're trying to help folks catch up and or feel like we're translating what we're doing into different terms from, I don't know, bygone eras, if I may be so bold. But thank you for sharing that. Shifra, do you care to share your experience, considering also you're based in the US?
Yeah. It's interesting also, I'm seeing similar trends. So definitely want to add to what Sally said. It also occurred to me that I haven't introduced JFREG at all. And I see a lot of JFREG members on this call, which is so nice. Hi. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about our grassroots fundraising model and why we have dues paying members on the call today. But JFREJ, or Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, is the home for the New York Jewish left. We organize Jews with our Jewish New Yorkers, with our allies and neighbors, to make New York a place where everyone has what they actually need to thrive, where we invest in social services that people need, and in the things that keep us safe. The types of campaigns that we focus on shift depending on the time and the landscape, but we work on issues related to the care economy, labor, policing, public education, and as a Jewish group in particular, also focus on anti-Semitism and the weaponization of anti-Semitism that is often used to shut down progressive movements and progressive leaders. So, okay, to answer your question, let's start with like what I see as some like good things that are happening in the funding landscape. You know, Sally and Scout, you both talked about like translating the work that we do. And I think that this idea of grassroots organizing is very foreign to traditional mainstream funders who are maybe more used to funding direct service, advocacy, education, like, and would have sort of different expectations of how to talk about work that focuses on kinds of deliverables and kinds of impact that is a little harder to talk about in the grassroots organizing world. But I think that's shifting a little bit. I think that there are some really exciting funders who understand what organizing means and are eager to fund it, and to educate other funders, which I think is particularly important for funders to be taking some of that burden off of their grantees, to be educating other funders about the kind of work that we do. I think that's good. I think in the US context, there has not been enough of a correction, but there is at least some movement towards funding more BIPOC-led organizations that have also traditionally been left out of funding priorities from philanthropic groups. Again, not enough, but at least some movement happening there. I also think there's, with some of the funders that we have that I've worked with previously, an understanding that like funding is like a kind of partnership. It's not just a transaction of money, that like being a funder also means developing real relationships with grantees. And that means speaking out in moments when maybe grantees are under attack. That means strategizing with grantees and being partners in the actual work and not just check writers, which I think is really exciting. Some things that I would love to see more of in this landscape I mean, this is like a little bit technical maybe, but like longer term grant making and gift making. It's really hard as an organization when from year to year, we don't know what our budget will be. We don't know which funders will stay with us. When we have longer term funding, we're able to plan, especially as grassroots organizations whose impact isn't felt sometimes month to month, even year to year. We're building power, we're changing material realities in that way. It's really important to have longer term secured funding, flexible, unrestricted funding. As I mentioned at the beginning, like the issue areas that we focus on might change depending on the context of what's happening in New York City, what's happening in the broader left, and to sort of be forced to commit to like 5 years from now, this is how much funding we're going to need to pay this person to do this work. Sometimes feels a little bit like we're playing this game with funders where we all kind of know that we don't know, but we have to put something on paper. A thing that I'll quickly mention that I'm happy to go into more, this might be relevant more in the US context, and something that JFREJ is seeing is a lack of funding for our 501c4 work. So JFREJ, like many community-based organizations, started off as a 501c3, which is like a tax. I don't know that much about taxes. This is what I know. It's like a tax category for organizations that are doing like education, organizing, but aren't doing directly political work. And in 2018, JFREJ members decided that actually was limiting for us, and there were other tools that we wanted to use. So they launched a 501c4, which is able to more directly engage in electoral work and in lobbying work. And it's been incredibly impactful for JFREJ, and it's harder to raise money for. And I think this is a trend across sort of the grassroots organizing world of like, in the US at least, with these tax laws, of organizations wanting to do more electoral work, understanding that's a really important tool in organizing, and funders still catching up. And funders are incentivized to be not giving to 501c4s because they're not getting the same kind of tax deductions as they would if they were giving to a 501c3. And I think that's an important thing to be agitating on and asking funders why that kind of tax deduction is important and what they're compromising by actually restricting the work of certain organizations by only giving to one kind of work that we do.
Wow. Right on. Thank you. Thank you for that list, right? And thanks for starting out with some positives, some movement. That feels good. And I'm wondering, knowing I can't see everyone, if this is resonating with folks. And I know that there are lots of folks who are in the Zoom room with us who have various relationships to funding, who have maybe received funding, applied for funding, are funders, are grassroots donors. And I really appreciate both of you mentioned there's some organizing to do with funders. There's organizing involving relationship building, and the idea being that if we're considering funding as a necessary component of our movement work, then that involves organizing funders, which is essentially what we're trying to do. I would love to hear from you all about how you felt receiving funding specifically from folks or from entities that are aligned with your values, that potentially, as Sally said, are like values aligned versus not aligned, and any examples of what that type of funding has made possible. So why does it matter, and what can we make happen with that type of funding? Anyone should feel free to start.
Yeah. I mentioned it already, but it enhances the relationship. In fact, it really changes the nature of the relationship. I think a lot of our work, when I reflect on our relationship with foundations and donors that are synced with our values and visions, the one I feel comfortable sharing our full strategy and full vision with, it just makes it much easier for us to go back and forth and actually think together about what are our aligned strategies, and what are actually our long-term outcomes and impact, desired impact that we want to see. And it becomes more than just, a very flat reporting and asking and reporting and dissecting things from our work that would actually be suitable for this funding, for this foundation, but actually strategizing together. And I think Shifra, you also mentioned it. What I see, the pattern is that they are strategically aligned philanthropists are actually providing more tools. So they're giving capacity building tools, they're giving strategy building tools. They're actually helping us understand how not only to measure our impact, but how do you build an action plan that is designed for you to be able to that enables you to understand your impact more. And it's not only important for understanding impact, it's more important for also, renewing, to front loading again and making it better, because we're really navigating things and we're doing a lot of errors. We find ourselves not only planning, a lot of our work is also reacting. Look at our reality here. We have this long strategy and this long plan, boom, 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 this is what we're going to do. And then, we have mass protests. We have a crazy, impossible government that is advancing, honestly, even with the whole difficulty in recent decades, it really has been advancing in unimaginable policies and laws, and you can't not react. So you need a partner that is forgiving. You need a donor that is forgiving, that deeply understands your mission and the challenges, and actually says, we understand that, you need to compromise on certain things, or maybe we understand that it takes a lot of resources to do both, to maintain your proactive strategic work while also reacting here's more money, you know, and we don't expect more outcomes, you know. And I think this is my experience with our strategically aligned donors, and it's something that is really much beyond, as I said, donor relation. It really, and it really makes also the ecosystem better. It feels less competitive, because you are not only aligned with the foundation, you're also aligned and connected to the other grantees, and they work in your ecosystem. You work together, and when it feels less competitive, and you actually, it becomes a place of, you know, grantees collaborating and working together, it actually enhances the creation of the ecosystem, which is crucial. Because it's not about competitiveness, it's really about creating this ecosystem and collaboration. So definitely those two things, the nature of the relationship, and just how we view ourselves in the whole bigger picture.
Oh, thank you, Sally. Yeah, there are a couple of things, and then we'll turn it to Shifra. That notion of needing a forgiving an understanding funder, which is, you know, when I think about my experience with funding, we would say a donor or a funder is incredible because they're not going to punish us or withdraw funding because we didn't meet this one objective. Like, that's the standard, is that, like, oh my gosh, we're not going to lose $20,000 because we taught 2 fewer classes. That's remarkable. I will say that that notion of forgiving and or flexible has to do, as you said, with deep understanding of what you're trying to do, right? Which is long-term building power and community change, right? That those day-to-day outcomes or year-to-year outcomes are not the same type of measurement as what we're looking for overall. That's one piece I want to really highlight. And the second is this notion of the competition between people seeking funding, the competition between organizations, and how that's connected both to white supremacy and also the sense of urgency that we might feel both in getting that funding, reporting, the way that we engage with donors, and the ways in which we also relate to our own work as resourcers of our movements. There's a sense of urgency that's quite overwhelming, competitive, and ultimately undercuts our work across different organizations and across movements. So Shifra, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the original question. And also, I don't know if that's a segue for you to talk a little bit about your grassroots funding model. Feel free to.
Cool. Well, I felt like a whoa when the two of you were talking about this sort of like funders not punishing you and like remaining flexible and responsive to changing needs in the moment, like especially in the kinds of work that Standing Together and that JFREG and that CJNV does. Like, some things are outside of our control. Like, you know, for example, like a super right-wing horrible mayor could be elected in New York City, and then like our priorities are going to change, and like what is a win and what is progress is going to change depending on the context. And so funders to understand that is so important. To answer the question about like alignment and what is possible and is alignment with funders, I think I want to answer that first. I think a lot about, especially at JFREG, sort of like this idea of like who we're accountable to, and like remaining accountable to our membership and to our organizational and movement partners. And I want to acknowledge that like in this world of how philanthropy works, there is like a power dynamic that exists between funders and grantees. And I think what's amazing about the organizations who are like sponsoring this event is like an acknowledging that power, and also like not leaning into that kind of power and attempting to control grantees, which is something that like we see in other places, and that I want to like be honest and real about, especially in a scarce fundraising landscape of funding pressure, even from a handful of donors, can make an organization like second guess themselves, or second guess what they want to talk about and how they want to speak about certain issues because of real or perceived threats to funding. At JFREG, and I'm sure the other organizations that are represented here today have chosen not to be swayed by that kind of funding pressure, and to remain accountable to our members and to our partners, and not to our donor base. but that's really hard. And just a couple weeks ago, JFREG lost funding that we were really hoping to get from a funder because of how we speak about Israel-Palestine publicly. Like that's a real concrete example that will affect our bottom line. And that's really real, and it's very understandable. So why certain organizations don't want to speak out about specific issues. And Israel-Palestine feels relevant also because of this panel, but like that's not the only issue that organizations could be scared to talk about around like abolition and policing or getting involved in certain elections because of what funders might think. And on the flip side, having aligned funding like really allows us to be brave and allows us to like lean into our principles, allows us to be accountable to our membership and to our movement in a different way. Even just in the last couple of years at JFREG, a lot of our members were clear with us as an organization that they wanted us to clarify our strategy on Israel-Palestine. Like, how is it a local issue? When do we speak out? How do we speak out? And because we have like really great funders, we could be honest and straight with our funders and be like, we're entering this process, a participatory process with all the stakeholders, including you, but also all of our members, in which our funders don't have unequal power. We're entering this process that will sharpen our strategy, and like you're invited along for it, but you're not going to dictate how it ends. And I think it's allowed us to like really particularly lead on this issue because we're not scared about what our funders will think if we speak about the truth. If we use terms that certain kinds of funders aren't going to like, or if, you know, we don't succumb to that pressure to sort of like stop speaking about hot topic issues because of what it could risk for us. So that's sort of like on the major donor side. On the institutional donor side, we're making larger gifts. And yeah, so JFREG also has a very important grassroots strategy, which I think is so important to who we are, and something that like I want to like challenge everyone who's here today to like see ourselves as organizers and as donors. Like a very important component of organizing is fundraising. It's one way to contribute. It's one way to put your resources into the movement that you believe in. And at JFREG, we actually in 2009, after the recession, like nearly closed our doors because a lot of wealthier people were not making the same kind of donations they were before the recession. And so we particularly, like we bounced back from that, and we like never want that to happen again, or for that to be like lingering, like a looming threat over us. And grassroots donations, like the way to make sure that we're sustainable in the long term.
I
Wow.
want to second that. I
Please.
resonate with that heavily. We're actually a democratic movement. We have over 4,000, actually a little bit over 4,300 members, monthly sustaining members, and it's you know, it's essential, also for the independence of the kind of work we want to do, but also because we are a democratic movement, and the people of the movement are actually the ones who decide what next we're going to do. And I think once, and obviously, the culture, the inner culture is something, and again, the alignment. And I'm going to give a very, very concrete example about the NIF. We led a minimum wage campaign to raise the livable wage. And when you think about a Jewish Arab grassroots movement in Israel, you don't think about, them fighting for minimum wage. And it really wasn't obvious. It was almost impossible to raise money for that. And it was mostly funded by our people, by our, the money that comes from grassroots, from our members, from our small donations. And at some point, we actually got to a peak level where we had to pass it through the Knesset, the parliament, and we didn't have the funding. And the NIF, urgency grant, which is something that it's very rare to find and such an aligned supporter that is able to understand immediately, strategically the connection between why are you doing a livable wage campaign and a social justice campaign, when you're trying to build a political capital for peace, for example. And it is exactly the kind of alignment that, makes it just so easy and really empowers us to also remain democratic, remain real and true to our members, to basically the people that own, standing together, while also being able to advance it in a way that they might not be able to fund it yet, which is crucial. So that resonates.
Right on. And that sense of like shared ownership, essentially, which ultimately we're wanting everyone to feel in terms of building not just wider, stronger, but also deeper movements. Yeah. I guess some thoughts that I have, Marty Levine put into the chat box, something that I wonder if you'll have some thoughts on. Marty says, you're looking for well-resourced supporters and not donors/grantors. We need to recognize that a philanthropic model is just another expression of wealth, class, and injustice. And while I definitely want to hear from both of you, your reactions to that, I also want to say you're on a call based on like what donors, like 2-3 donors who have funded us, invited us to this call. So clearly you're not opting out of engagement with the philanthropic model. So please share your thoughts on what Marty has shared and how you would respond in terms of what you and your organizations are doing in terms of balancing multiple sources of funding.
Do you want to go for that one first?
Sure. Yeah. Like I like agree with a lot of what you're saying, like Marty. I think in terms of like individual donors, like we don't treat individual donors differently than we do any JFREG member. And I have a lot of understanding for organizations that function differently. Like there's a reason why there's like this model, like wining and dining and giving perks and access, because fundraising is hard. And that's like one way that we can sort of like increase donations from people is by giving them more perks. And it's not the way that I think like a movement for justice and equality, an anti-capitalist movement should be functioning. And sort of like, yeah, giving more, this idea of like access, like individual donors who give more have more access to decision making, whether it's like more face time with decision makers, or if it's like being in these brain trusts, they get to make more decisions. A lot of boards function that way. Like you sort of have to give a certain amount of money to sit on a board, and then you have a different amount of influence. I say that, and I think that, like I said, fundraising is organizing. I think there is room on a board for someone who is like interested in moving money, and moving money to help an organization succeed. But it's all about actual relationships, about actual alignment, it's about strategy, and not about doing what a specific donor wants us to do.
Yeah, now you said it and I never thought about it. Like we're a democratic movement. We don't even, like our board is just legal, we actually have an elected leadership every year and a half. So it's completely, I can't even think about it in that model, but I also understand why it happens that way, because it's also, it's survival. It's the way it is. It's the way you actually get more money. And I do think that, while we are also redefining the way we do work, and the political protagonists and we're really redefining so many things. We're probably also redefining our relationship with donors, with supporters. As you said, we have thousands of people that donate like $3, every month, and they're the stakeholders. They're the ones who actually elect people. They're the ones who decide on what we're going to do next. And I think being able to communicate that with donors who give us much more is actually important. It's actually one of the most being able to tell that kind of story actually helps us align them with us strategically. Even if they're not used to that kind of model with others, I think it helps tell our story. It's exactly through that kind of model of we're a democratic movement. This is how our decision making is being made. There's nothing we can do about it. It's democratic, and you're welcome to support it. Obviously, it probably does cost us a couple of, potential supporters, but it definitely does create, redefine the relationship with donors just organically. I never even thought about it as an option. It just organically redefines the relationship.
Thank you both. Yeah, that notion of the way that we're doing the work should be practicing our values. The way that we do fundraising should be aligned with our values, both in individual relationships. And Marty's question, and then other folks are engaging a bit in the chat, is also noting that we are in process, in movement work ongoingly to, shift power dynamics. And it can't be all or nothing. And we're also like making the path as we build it, or as we engage each donor, each individual donor, and I think for me in particular in navigating JLF funding, about how the ways in which people are encouraged to navigate both deadlines, explanations for why they need funding or what specifically it will be used for. All of those are different ways in which we start to navigate power dynamics of who has, who does not, who earns or deserves, who does not, and who also has the power to resource our movements, right? So that $3 a month is just as important to engage with thoughtfully as we're engaging today with a variety of different foundations and funding organizations. So we're gonna shift in a moment to the Q&A. Some folks have submitted questions, and I will just say, please know that if you're in your 20s or 30s, you are invited to stay on the Zoom for an extra 30 minutes. There's going to be a talk back and discussion facilitated by NIS New Gen leader Noah Barish. So you can just hang on the Zoom. For now, we have a question specifically for Shifra, and then we'll have another question for Sally. So for Shifra, someone wrote, as you said, there's a sense that there isn't enough money on the left, which makes sense structurally. I've seen it in a lot of progressive to mainstream orgs from taking more progressive stances. How might we create fiscal safety for doing more progressive work?
That's such a great question. I think certainly the sort of grassroots fundraising is one of the answers, is resourcing ourselves and not having to rely on sort of folks with more means to sort of swoop in and fund the broader left. But I also think there is a little bit of agitation and conversations that need to be happening with funders on the left to understand what we're up against. That the right is not having these issues. Folks there give, and they give big, and they give unrestricted, and they give for the most hateful things. And they're not bogged down sometimes with this sort of nuances of conversations that exist on the left. People just sort of give, there's just more money there. And I think that there is maybe not all of us are in those funding rooms to have those kinds of agitational conversations, but I do think there needs to be a real conversation around moving bigger amounts of money into progressive spaces.
Yeah, thanks, Shifra. I appreciate also wanting to name, there are folks in this room who might be in those spaces, who might be able to engage in that agitation. And I know we'll have a little bit of time for summary at the end, but I hope folks are thinking throughout today's conversation, what is my role in making this shift towards more values-aligned philanthropic giving, whether you're one of the grassroots funders, whether you are in relationships, friends, family, loved ones with people who are involved in organizing, resourcing our movements, that there is a role for agitation for sure, and not all of us may be able to play it in the same way, but feels like it's necessary. Thank you. Sally, anything to add before we go on to a question directed to you? Great.
No.
So, right on. Someone asked, can you address the effect on funding by the current legislation in the Knesset to minimize funding for NGOs and civil society organizations?
Yeah. So it really relates more. It's a legislation that was actually postponed. It was supposed to happen this week, and they postponed it for another month. Let's see. I can say that there's a lot of pressure from abroad to not make it happen. Not allow it to happen, but it does actually relate more to funding from foreign entities, which means like foreign governments. So any USAID, EU, all of these big foundations really, funding, streaming tens of millions of dollars, really, if not more, into the Israeli and Palestinian, peace building, as well as civil society, and it is going to be very, very problematic for many of our NGOs and our especially human rights NGOs who heavily rely on foreign government funding. It's going to be very limiting. Thankfully, standing together doesn't accept any kind of governmental money, Israeli or foreign, at all, zero. And we are kind of thankful that we don't at this point. We are really. But it can really be very limiting. And again, anything that's bad for our ecosystem is bad for us. So it is concerning to us regardless. It is really going to limit. It's already so limiting. You talked before about elections and about engagements where really we're being suffocated right now. We are constantly being sued and being really monitored with all of the actions that we do, any kind of political action that can be partisan or can, relate to anything that is remotely in the gray area. They're putting a lot of efforts of persecution in that sense. So it's much beyond funding. It really is just about limiting our space for activism and for free speech, and really it's very concerning.
And feels also in line with other limitations to not just funding, but larger free speech and academic freedom. Yeah. So I want to name that the other question that we have about 501c3c4 funding will be for Shifra. And also want to encourage, with just a few minutes left, others to add your questions into the Q&A section, which you can find by clicking the three dots that say more on your screen, or you should see a button to click Q&A on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So the question regarding 501c3 and 501c4 funding is, what legal fundraising tools are right-wing organizations using to maximize donations within the limits of 501c3 and 501c4? How can we adapt those tools to our missions and values? And Shifra, that's for you.
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to this. I'd be curious to hear if folks have suggestions of things that are within the legal realm, not, misleading the kind of work that we're doing, or saying that things are fit within one structure, but in fact are not. Yeah, I don't have a direct answer to this.
And there are a couple.
I'm
sorry to interrupt. Yeah, folks are saying
Um,
donor advised funds and also unrestricted funding.
Yeah, so when we have conversations with our major donors, we talk about this quite directly, that folks who have bigger gifts to give can do so unrestricted, can give money to the 501c4 entity, and it's so much more flexible in terms of the kind of work that we can do that we funded by those dollars. And the only loss to the giver is the tax deduction. And so asking why is the tax deduction so important? why would someone need that benefit in order to give that type of money? I also know that more like philanthropic foundations are also like opening up to giving unrestricted or 501c4 funding. I think it's something new. I think it's something really exciting. And yeah, I'd be like eager to continue those conversations. If there's any other strategies beyond getting people to give unrestricted funding, if there's any tax loops that we're missing that we should be utilizing, let us know. And 501c4 is for political, like engaging directly in political work, either elections or in lobbying, just to clarify that difference.
And Shifra, I heard an invitation to continue both this conversation and being in network with one another to share strategies. So flagging that. The last question I'm going to ask both of y'all, just as we close out, is if y'all had all the resources in the world, all that you needed, all that you wanted, what project would you focus on? Is there one idea or project or effort you would focus on if you had those valued aligned resources that you want and need?
I love this question. Do we have another hour? No. Really organizing. I would literally, like, the amount of people that have interest in the movement. It's Israelis, Israeli society is so good at mobilizing. We know how to get on the streets. And that's such amazing, momentum right now, what's happening right now. And we just find ourselves, really not being able to absorb all the energy back into like sustainable infrastructure and sustainable leaderships, and, actually be able to build the grassroots from this momentum into something that is more long-term, because let's be honest, these mobilizations are not gonna last forever. They're definitely surprising us with the with the time they're lasting, but it's just not gonna last. So one thing I would do is just probably, if we would have like 5 times the organizers we have now, easily, we would know exactly what to do with them. Easily 5 times. Yeah. Which is frustrating because we find ourselves overloaded and overworked and exhausted, and it's not sustainable. So that's what I would do, and just build infrastructures everywhere, peripheries especially. The base of the current government, they are suffocating economically and otherwise. They're suffocating, and we need to create that conflict and capitalize on it to weaken the current government, and actually, try and start imagining the new kind of people's movement that we need to build here.
Thank you, Sally. Shifra, go for it.
This is such a fun question. I'm not sure I would say there's like whole areas of work that we would like start from scratch. I think that we're fairly focused. I think we know our strategy. And I think that strategy needs more funding. For example, JFred has lots of really beautiful arts and cultural organizing. And we need more funding to pay artists and cultural organizers. We need more funding to create the internal infrastructure and staffing to support that work more intentionally. We have amazing identity-based caucuses at JFred that also like launched years ago and are going through a process now, sort of being revived, and need more funding and attention. Our campaigns and our organizers need more funding and attention. And I also think that sort of pushing back on this like scarcity mindset is, if we had lots of funding at our disposal, I think we would look at the broader ecosystem and think about where we can do solidarity fundraising. Because even as I say that, well, we're so under-resourced, there are others who are less resourced, who have even less access to funding than we do. And being able to do some solidarity fundraising for the amazing partners that we work with here in New York, and seeing how, like, when the whole ecosystem is lifted up, everyone's work is improved. That would be beautiful. We'd love to do more of that.
Right, and I hear that too with regard to the periphery notion that, Sally, you both are talking about how do we expand essentially to include everyone, with the notion that our liberations are bound together, and that we're always trying to build, again, relationships and deepen the work we do across organizations. So I will close it for here for now before turning it over to Jordan and just say, I think y'all did a little bit of what you were talking about by coming together today. And it's been an honor to be with you, to hear from both of you, and to have space with so many movement leaders today in the Zoom room. So Jordan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Shifra, it was great to hear you talk about